in Cuba territory. And really grateful that folks took a little bit of time out of what I'm sure is a really busy time for a lot of people. We have folks that I see from up in Anishinaabe territory, comrades in Cuba territory. Yeah, so it's great to see everybody. Today, we're going to be doing a little bit of work that I know that the New Mexico chapter of the Venceremos Brigade has done a lot of work pushing back against imperialist US propaganda about Cuba, and something that the Albuquerque Anti-War Coalition has joined in the last few months in doing the last Sunday of every month, some kind of rally or virtual political education to further, again, counter imperialist propaganda that serves to repress countries that are trying to throw off the yoke of imperialism or fight for self-determination. And so in particular today, we'll be talking a little bit about Havana Syndrome, which is a strategy that the United States has used to attack Cuba and other countries that are not serving the interests of US capital. And so for the agenda, we're going to start with just a little kind of a fun quiz to get serve as an introduction to some of those topics, again, about ways that the US has repressed anti-colonial struggles across the globe, including in this particular way. And then we'll watch The Belly of the Beast, which is produced, I think it's a 6-part series. And we'll watch episode 4, which is specifically about Havana Syndrome. And then we're going to have a discussion together. And hopefully it won't take too long. We don't want to take too much out of y'all's day. And so hoping to wrap up between 4 and 4:15 Mountain Time. And I think that's it for the intro. Again, thank you so much for joining. And I'm going to turn it over to my comrade, Onya Sonwu, who's going to help us with the quiz.
Thanks, Keegan. Let me just make sure that I am visible on this screen. Hello. Hi, everybody. So as Keegan mentioned, we want to start off the event today by having a little bit of an interactive quiz that we put together. We basically want to know, how much do y'all know about how the US has repressed anti-colonial struggles and anti-imperialist nations? So yeah, there's no score. It's not serious unless you want it to be. It's okay if you get it wrong, but we're going to take this quiz together. There are 6 questions. And so we have them up in this app. And so as we ask each question, all you got to do is either put your response in the chat or feel free to come off mic and share your guess. So without further ado, this is a quiz prepared by the Albuquerque Anti-War Coalition that's going to test how much we as a group know about US efforts to repress anti-colonial struggles. So let's do it. So first question, which of these strategies has the CIA, aka Criminals in Action, aka the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, not used to repress anti-colonial struggles? Option 1, staging vampire attacks in the Philippines. Option 2, faking the moon landing to embarrass the USSR. Option 3, selling drugs in the United States to fund regime change in Nicaragua. And option 4, creating a fake vaccination campaign in Pakistan. So of those 4 options, which has the CIA not done to repress anti-colonial struggles?
I'm going to jump in quickly because on my screen, I think I only see your background. Is that the case for other people as well?
1 second. I'm sharing the wrong window, maybe? Let me try this. Does that work?
Yeah, it looks great.
Cool. Thank you so much. All right. So 1, 2, 3, or 4. Which has the US not done? And again, you can put it in the chat. You can come off mute. Whatever you feel comfortable doing.
2 folks voting for option 1. 2 folks for 2. No, 3 folks for 2.
Option 2. Any other guesses? We got option 1 with 2 folks and option 2, 3 folks. Any other guesses before we reveal the answer? Cool. So the correct answer is actually option 2, The moon landing was not faked. They did actually do that. However, can I go back to the question? Because we want to give some context. Can I go back? No, I can't. Okay, so some of the other options in that question, for example, a couple of folks answered option 1, that the CIA had never staged vampire attacks in the Philippines. That's actually not true. The CIA did, in fact, stage vampire attacks in the Philippines. What happened was there was a resistance movement to US occupation of the Philippines, and the US was trying to rout out some guerrilla fighters, and so they convinced people living in the surrounding area that people were being attacked by vampires who just happened to live where the guerrillas were. And so they staged those attacks in order to convince the people living in that area to turn against the resistance. So that is a thing the CIA actually did. And then Keegan, did you have additional context about Pakistan?
Yeah, and I think it's especially relevant, just real briefly, in light of the way that like the current US administration is trying to paint this as like a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Well, in Pakistan, when the United States was hunting Osama bin Laden, they created a fake, well, it was a vaccination campaign against, I think, hepatitis B, in order to literally get people's blood samples to try and find a relative of Osama bin Laden to try and track him more efficiently. And when they did this, it worked, and they killed him, right? They just like pulled out all of the vaccination efforts. So there are a bunch of children who are only like partially vaccinated against hepatitis B, and polio had been eradicated in that region of Pakistan, but because of people's really, extremely understandable skepticism and fear of public health and vaccination campaigns going forward, polio has started to make a comeback in that region because people are really, so it's not as simple as a pandemic being vaccinated, which I think is relevant here. Cool. I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, thanks for that context. That makes me very, very angry. So let's move on to the next question. Question number 2 is, which of these strategies has the CIA not used to repress anti-colonial struggles? So very similar. The first question is part 2 of the first question. So option 1, invading Guatemala and overthrowing its president for a fruit company. Option 2, helping Panama win independence so the US could build and control the Panama Canal. Option 3, lobbing hand grenades near a school in Indonesia, an assassination attempt against Indonesia's head of state. And option 4, coordinating with 1930s Nazi Germany to put down uprisings in Africa. So which of those 4 options has the CIA not actually done to repress anti-colonial struggles in the world? I actually don't know the answer to this one. Oh yeah, so folks are saying option 3 is the one that they did not do. One person saying option 2 they did not do. And another answer, option 4, they didn't do. 4.
Well, I love this. I like that this one's difficult.
They're so monstrous that you can't tell which is satire and which is reality. It's pretty wild. So we got a widespread, basically everything but one people have said, because I think people know. So my guess is maybe 3 is not true? I don't know. So let's find out. Dang! So they did actually do that. They did actually throw a grenade at a head of state.
The right one is the coordinating with 1930s Nazi Germany, not because this doesn't sound like something the CIA would do, but it's kind of a trick question because the CIA just wasn't formed until 1947. So sorry for the trick question. But
so I wasn't gonna say that one was wrong because the Axis powers or the Alliance powers did collaborate with each other and with the Axis powers to repress anti-colonial uprisings in Africa during World War II. So I was gonna say that one was true. But now you just pointed out the CIA didn't exist yet. So dang.
Yeah,
Okay,
sneaky,
cool.
sorry.
All right. So again, the correct answer was option 4. They did not coordinate with 1930s Nazi Germany to put down uprisings in Africa, simply because the CIA did not exist. Next question. What is Havana Syndrome? And this is a picture of the Republican senator from Florida, Marco Rubio, noted Guzano. So what is Havana Syndrome? Option 1, a set of medical symptoms with unknown causes experienced abroad by US government personnel. Option 2, A mild flu-like illness brought to Miami when ruling class Cubans arrived after the Cuban Revolution. Option 3, when you're really scared of communism. And option 4, whatever Marco Rubio has. So, of those 4 options, which correctly describes what Havana Syndrome is supposed to be? Option 1. Any thoughts?
I love that we got to vote for number 4.
I think it's 4. Any other thoughts? Oh, it seems like mostly ones. So let's go with 1. And that's correct. According to the US government, Havana Syndrome is a set of medical symptoms with unknown causes experienced abroad by US government personnel. Additional explanation: though the US government has asserted that people have suffered brain damage from Havana Syndrome, there is, quote, there is no evidence of any pathology when you look at the data. There's no coherent syndrome, no pattern. It appears to be a psychogenic illness rather than a real one. We're going to learn a little bit more about what that means later on in the program, but for now, let's move on to question 4. The US government has committed to pay reparations for option 1, the dispossession through genocide and land theft of peoples indigenous to Turtle Island. Option 2, enslaving African people. Option 3, harm to the victims of Havana Syndrome. Option 4, the 20-year occupation and destruction of Afghanistan. What has the US government committed to pay reparations for? I see 3, a couple for 3. Harm to the victims of Havana Syndrome. It seems unanimous 3. Any other options? Mickey! Sorry. Looks like it's unanimously 3. So is it true that the US government has committed to pay reparations to victims of Havana Syndrome? Yes, it is true. Not for slavery, not for stealing land, not for occupying and destroying dozens of countries. No, the US on October 8th, 2021, had President Biden sign the Havana Act to ensure we are doing our utmost to provide for US government personnel who experience anomalous health incidents. The Havana Act authorizes the Department of Homeland Security and the US State Department to straight up pay damages, pay reparations to US government employees who claim to have suffered from Havana Syndrome. That is who gets reparations from the US government. Next question. Which was the first country to get sanctioned? Is this a question from this? Yes. Okay, that's right. Okay, so which was the first country to get sanctioned by the United States? Option 1, Cuba. Option 2, Iran. Option 3, Venezuela. Option 4, Haiti. Which was the first country to get sanctioned by the United States? 1 for 4 is Haiti. 2, Iran. 4, Haiti. A couple for 4. It looks like the majority are saying 4. We got 1 vote for 1 and 1 vote for 2. Any other guesses? 1, 4. Okay. Majority is saying 4. Was Haiti? Yes, it was. Haiti was the very first country to be sanctioned by the US government under then President Thomas Jefferson. He imposed an embargo on Haiti after the Haitian Revolution that cut off trade with that nation from 1806 to 1808. The US also refused to recognize Haitian independence until 1862. So Haiti was the first country ever sanctioned by the US government for the so-called crime of those Africans liberating themselves from slavery. And then last question. Which country has offered unconditional medical aid to countries suffering from disease, natural disasters, or other catastrophes? Option 1 is Cuba. Option 2, Australia. Option 3, Japan. And option 4, the United States. Which of those 4 countries has offered unconditional medical aid to countries suffering from natural disasters and other catastrophes? It seems to be unanimously number 1, Cuba. Greetings, Ricky. Good to see you. Any other guesses? Are we going with one? Y'all already know. You already know. It's Cuba. So Cuba is the correct answer to that question. Since 2005, 28 groups from Cuba's Henry Reeve Medical Brigade have carried out humanitarian missions in 22 countries with almost 8,000 medical professionals fighting the effects of 16 floods, 8 hurricanes, 8 earthquakes, 4 epidemics, including 3 teams that faced the West African Ebola virus pandemic or epidemic. And we also know throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, which is now entering its 3rd year, Cuba has sent doctors, medicine, and medical solidarity all over the world to fight the global struggle against COVID-19. So, and then also I recently learned that the Henry Reeve Medical Brigade, like Henry Reeve was a US military soldier who joined the Cuban independence movement when he was deployed to Cuba, and he became a Cuban national hero. It's kind of wild. Anyway, so yeah, the correct answer was Cuba. Cuba has provided unconditional solidarity to nations all over this world for a very, very long time. So that was the quiz. We just wanted to get y'all in the mindset of thinking about how trifling the United States actually is when it comes to interfering in the affairs of other countries. There is truly no depths below which the United States will not go to attack anti-colonial and anti-imperialist movements and nations. And so we shared a little bit of the history in that quiz. And now we're going to watch a brief documentary about the latest iteration of these like US dirty tricks being deployed against Cuba, specifically talking about Havana Syndrome, why it's ridiculous, and what the US is trying to do by claiming it's a thing.
Building, that's the US Embassy.
Good.
When I walk...
Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen, and we're gonna play this video. It's about 20 minutes long. And then after the video is over, Keegan is going to facilitate a discussion amongst those of us in the Zoom about what we just watched and what we should take from it. So if you have any issues, actually, let me optimize this for video. There we go. Cool. If you have any issues hearing or seeing, please let me know in the chat and I will fix.
Hi, I'm Liz. See that building? That's the US Embassy. When I was 6 years old, my grandma used to bring me on marches here to the Malecón, al frente de la tribuna antiimperialista.
Somos revolucionarios y nos cambiamos de camisa.
Fidel Castro would give speeches, but I never saw him because the crowd was too big to get close.
It was so much fun, jumping and chatting. Es que no salté ya aquí.
But in 2014, everything changed. The two countries re-established relations. 8 months later, the US Embassy officially reopened.
Dos pueblos ya no enemigos ni rivales, sino vecinos.
The goodwill didn't last long.
The U.S. believes several State Department employees at the U.S. Embassy in Havana have been subjected to acoustic attacks.
Like a Cold War spy novel.
Perhaps some sort of ultrasonic spy weapon was used.
The symptoms include hearing loss,
dizziness, headache, fatigue,
unexplained sounds in their residences.
The Cuban government either did this or they know who did it.
I do believe Cuba is responsible. I do believe that, and it's a very unusual attack.
Mysterious attacks,
acoustic attacks,
sonic attack,
sonic attack.
The Trump administration announced Friday that it is pulling more than half of its staff out of the American embassy in Havana.
The U.S. shut down consular services for Cubans, making it almost impossible to get a visa. Scaling down the embassy also marked an end to U.S. engagement with Cuba. Trump reversed Obama's Cuba policy, and on top of that, he imposed new sanctions that devastated our economy. COVID made things even worse.
Pero por suerte, Biden was elected.
No te adelantes a los acontecimientos. Under Biden, nothing's changed.
Tenemos que asegurarnos de que nuestro personal en la embajada no corran peligro de un ataque de microondas, o no sé cómo lo están llamando hoy.
There is no evidence of an attack, Pero ¿desde cuándo las políticas de agresión de los Estados Unidos dependen de la evidencia?
Saddam Hussein is determined to keep his weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Operation Iraqi Freedom has begun.
If they lied and manipulated public opinion to invade Iraq, ¿qué puede esperar esta islita del Caribe? For Johanna Tablada, hanging laundry isn't a chore. It's a moment of calm before a long day at a stressful job.
Hola.
¿Cómo estás?
Bien, bien, sube.
Johanna helps oversee relations with the U.S. at Cuba's Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
La gente se pregunta, Johanna, por fin Biden, ¿cuándo va a hacer algo? Johanna, mi hija, que quiere venir, que quiero ir a ver a mis nietos, ¿cuándo van a abrir la embajada? Es todo el tiempo.
¿Y nunca te llegaron a preguntar por los incidentes de salud de los diplomáticos?
Me han preguntado poco porque eso en Cuba nadie se lo cree. Este es el apartamento donde vivimos nosotros, muy jovencitos los dos.
In the 90s, Johanna spent 4 years at the Cuban Interest Section in Washington, D.C.
Yo estuve como en 35 ciudades de Estados Unidos. Esto fue en la Cámara Estadual de Springfield, Illinois, la primera que aprobó un proyecto de ley en favor del levantamiento del bloqueo a Cuba.
20 years later, Johanna helped lead bilateral talks after the two countries re-established relations.
Fue un momento de mucha alegría porque le había dedicado casi toda mi vida profesional a trabajar para ese día. Se dice mucho por ahí que Obama hizo grandes concesiones a Cuba. Eso no es verdad. Los dos ganamos.
¿Cuál fue la reacción del gobierno de Cuba ante la noticia de los incidentes de salud de los diplomáticos estadounidenses en Cuba?
Dijimos, estamos absolutamente dispuestos a colaborar en todo. Se hizo una investigación exhaustiva, tanto en el área de la ciencia como en el área forense, y la investigación nuestra arriba a las mismas conclusiones que después de 4 visitas a Cuba, arriba el FBI. No había evidencia que pudiese existir ningún tipo de ataque contra diplomáticos en Cuba. Cuba nunca ha cuestionado que diplomáticos estadounidenses o canadienses se pudieron sentir mal en Cuba. Una cosa son los síntomas y otra cosa son las causas. Lo que sí se puede dejar claramente es que a partir de esas acusaciones infundadas se establece la llamada política de máxima presión. Fueron a la yugular de la economía de Cuba.
Entonces, según me dices, esto fue un pretexto para las medidas que vinieron después.
Sin duda. Cuando hay 1,3 millones de personas de Estados Unidos visitando Cuba cada año, cuando hay un hotel Marriott en La Habana, cuando las universidades tienen más de 300 acuerdos y vienen estudiantes 3 y 4 veces al año a aprender español, ¿cómo a sangre fría tú puedes detener un proceso que tiene un respaldo universal?
¿Quién gana con todo esto?
Alguien debe ganar con esto, pero definitivamente no es Cuba. Cuba ha perdido mucho con esto.
The politics is easy for me to understand. The science, though, that's a more complicated story, and it begins in Miami. Dr. Michael Hofer was the first to examine the U.S. Embassy personnel.
When they saw me, they just didn't feel quite right.
As a military doctor in 2009, Hofer gave an unapproved drug to U.S. soldiers suffering from traumatic brain injury in Iraq. Turns out, Hofer held 2 patents on the drug. Several years later, Hofer was pitching another product.
We expect and hope that these goggles will be on the market in the next 12 months.
Hofer used the goggles he helped invent to diagnose the U.S. personnel.
The University of Miami does concussions for a living, and that's important.
By August 2017, the State Department had moved on from Hofer. The U.S. diplomats and CIA agents were sent to the University of Pennsylvania. The UPenn investigators published their findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA. They suggested the U.S. personnel appeared to have sustained brain injuries. Then, the State Department commissioned a study by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, NASEM. NASEM concluded that microwaves were the most plausible cause of the symptoms.
We viewed this as plausible, but again, we didn't have any direct evidence that this could explain the entire story, or even parts of it. we were not confident.
The media, though, showed no lack of confidence in the microwave theory. And soon, reports of microwave attacks appeared everywhere.
The condition has now spread beyond Cuba to every continent.
In Vienna, China, Russia, in India,
Uzbekistan, Bogota,
Havana Syndrome in Hanoi.
Directed pulse microwave energy.
Possible attacks are being carried out by foreigners.
Directed energy attack.
This is so weird.
The media reports may be weird, but the science isn't.
The public was being exposed to information that really was not scientifically based.
Nobody has seen the raw data. This is anti-science.
If you're going to posit a microwave weapon, you have to show that such a weapon exists.
What's your opinion of the University of Pennsylvania study?
Data was flawed. There were MRI of the brain were essentially normal. And there's absolutely no evidence that anybody has had brain damage.
They assessed these people with 37 tests. And the criterion that they used to establish that they were pathological was failing at least at one of these 37 measures. The threshold that they used was 40% of the population, which means that the authors, the editors, the US personnel, anybody tested with those criteria would be classed as pathological.
There have been reports of microwave attacks, not just in Havana, but everywhere. What do you make of this?
It has not been shown that microwaves cause the symptoms that people are describing. In order to have something happen inside someone's skull, you'd have to char the outside first. Back in the 1970s, the military asked us, can you make directed energy weapons? There were a number of people at Los Alamos who were looking into this possibility. We've been trying to do it for 50 years. It just doesn't work in the real world.
One of the big issues is mass psychogenic illness, and there have been studies suggesting about 50% of patients have symptoms and complaints where after complete medical evaluation, no explanation for the symptoms can be found. I see patients with these symptoms on almost a daily basis, and nearly all of those are so-called psychosomatic symptoms. Most people have symptoms every day, and if you focus on them, and if you become very attentive to them, they actually become magnified.
Michel Valdez Sosa is the director of the Cuban Center for Neuroscience. He leads a team of Cuban scientists who have investigated the Havana health incidents. Dr. Michel, did you study the diplomats?
We're never offered the opportunity of working with the clinical histories of the diplomats, the results of their images. We simply had to read what was published. Not having access to the data makes research on this topic very difficult. But it doesn't take that much research to be able to simply eliminate some of the explanations which are continuously being propelled by the media. However, trying to be heard is extremely difficult. We've written to several journals, we've written to newspapers, and most of them don't want to touch the story except if it's the official version that's being supported from the United States.
Today, Mitchell is heading to a press conference to present his team's latest report. How is talking to the media?
The media still talks about the Havana Syndrome. It's a real new disease, and this narrative has no scientific basis. It's difficult to understand how many people have swallowed this story with no critical thinking.
Okay, but why now?
It's still an obstacle to normalization of relationships between the US and Cuba. So if you don't take the trouble to debunk false beliefs, they simply multiply and they can influence people. We need to set the record straight.
In 2018, Mitchell, who was born in Chicago, traveled with his team to Washington, D.C. They hope to collaborate with U.S. doctors and scientists investigating the incidents. Instead, Mitchell says State Department officials refused their request.
Why do you think it's mistaken to refer to this phenomenon as Havana Syndrome?
All the symptoms like vertigo, like dizziness, like sleep disorders, headaches, very, very common. So this is an heterogeneous group which could be explained by known symptoms. You can't give a name to something that doesn't exist.
¿Cómo ustedes responden a los cuestionamientos que surgen debido a la parcialidad que pudieran tener sus conclusiones, sobre todo por los vínculos de la Academia de Ciencias de Cuba con el gobierno cubano?
The same could be said about the National Academy of Sciences and their report in the States. In fact, they were paid by the State Department to make the report. So we're not saying, believe us. We're saying, let's critically examine our proposals, our explanations.
Dr. Mitchell, ¿qué le pareció la conferencia?
This is going to be hard because there's like a wall. The international media usually reflects what is being said in the U.S. But I think that eventually the truth will come out.
Hear that sound? Son los culpables de los supuestos ataques sónicos. Grillos. Don't believe me? Ask the State Department.
In 2018, the State Department secretly hired a group of elite scientists called JASON. Not even NASA knew about it. The JASON report found that crickets were most likely the source of the sound heard by US personnel in Havana. Microwaves were largely ruled out, and psychogenic illness was cited as a possible cause. The Trump administration buried the JASON report. 3 years later, it was revealed by journalist Dan Bergano. You think major US media outlets would pick up this story? Instead, most ignored it completely. Dylan lo tiene todo, o casi todo. She has a girlfriend and a dog. She works as a freelance graphic designer and has a business making and selling artisanal lamps. She lives in a nice house and has a garden. But like many Cubans, she's missing something important: her family.
Hello. ¿Ya desayunaste? Yo ya desayuné. ¿Y tú?
Dylan's mother, father, and sister emigrated to Tampa, Florida in 2015. Dylan stayed behind, but that wasn't the plan.
La familia por parte de madre fue la primera en irse, hace el proceso de reclamación para mi mamá. Y entonces el núcleo familiar entramos en ese proceso de reclamación. Fuimos todos para la embajada americana, mis padres, mi hermano y yo. Yo estaba preparada psicológicamente para irme. Y entonces en la entrevista, cuando empezamos a dar los papeles y todo, los míos los viraron para atrás en el ventanillo. La mujer le dijo a mamá que no podía ir. Y dice, no, ella tiene ya 21 años. Y tiene que empezar el proceso de ella cuando lleguen allá, ustedes.
¿Cómo te sentiste?
Me sentí triste, pero en ese momento no podía como demostrarlo. Porque si no podía demostrar así que estaba triste, porque entonces mi mamá iba a decir que no se iba.
A year after moving to the US, her mom requested a visa for Dylan, but it was too late. ¿Recuerdas qué fue lo que pensó cuando escuchó que la administración de Trump iba a cerrar la embajada?
Morirse, porque ya sabía ya que eso era demorar el proceso y bueno, demorar que yo fuera para allá.
It's been 6 years since Dylan's family left Cuba, and Dylan is still waiting for her visa.
Mira, ¿qué has oído de lo del abogado que tú sigues?
No, eso todavía se coge su tiempito.
Dylan moved on with her life in Cuba. Then, in March, she learned her visa process was finally moving forward. ¿Cómo te sentiste cuando tu mamá te dio la noticia de que finalmente el proceso había comenzado?
Por una parte, súper feliz. Y por otra parte, caigo en la vida que tengo acá, de que el día ese que quizás me tenga que ir y mi novia se tenga que quedar, mi perrito. No se pueden hacer planes así. Es frustrante. Mi vida, como tal, socialmente, se ve afectada por la administración que hay allá.
Y esperar que la próxima decisión no te afecte.
Exacto, y esperar que la próxima decisión nos beneficie.
The FBI, CIA, CDC, NASA, NIH, none of them have produced evidence of attacks. In March, Biden created the Health Incident Response Task Force. But after 6 months, Pamela Spratlen, the diplomat running the task force, was gone. Spratlen's exit came after she reportedly declined to rule out the possibility of psychogenic illness. 2 weeks later, Biden passed the law to provide payments to victims afflicted by neurological attacks. It's called the Havana Act. The next week, U.S. personnel claiming to have been attacked in Havana spoke publicly for the first time.
I'll just play it for you so you can hear.
It was a lot worse earlier. It was like I had been seized by some invisible hand and I couldn't move.
Andrea, those stories are truly frightening. What do we know about who could be behind these attacks?
U.S. diplomats and CIA agents will be compensated for their injuries. But the Cuban people continue to pay the price.
Llevo 16 meses esperando la aprobación.
Llevo 2 años en proceso de reunificación con mi esposo.
2 años y medio en proceso.
4 años.
4 años y medio.
4 años y medio.
6 años y medio.
7 años.
7 años en proceso.
Llevo 5 años en el proceso.
Reopening the embassy will help reunite thousands of families, but it won't solve a much bigger problem. El cierre de la embajada es solo la punta del iceberg.
Quienes piensan que los Estados Unidos en este momento va a entrar en un diálogo de múltiples años con Cuba, yo creo que no entiende el momento político. Joe Biden no es Barack Obama.
For the Cuban people, it doesn't seem to matter if the U.S. president is Trump or Biden, Republican or Democrat. Al final, la guerra contra Cuba es la misma.
All right.
All right.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to pass it to you, so take it away.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Oni. I actually hadn't seen that before, so I learned some stuff. Yeah, so we just wanted to do a brief discussion for the next maybe 15, 20 minutes, and I'm going to throw a couple questions into the chat. I think feel free to jump in, and I'll if 2 people jump in at the same time, we'll just try and do it in the order that people unmuted or something. But so the first question is thinking about what we learned just now about what Havana Syndrome is and the way it's affecting people on the island. What function does providing this misinformation about Havana Syndrome serve in terms of from the perspective of the United States? And people can think of that as broadly as they'd like, but I'm just curious what folks' reaction to that is, kind of initial reactions to the documentary we just saw. And feel free to just unmute and come on if you'd like, or you can also type something in the chat and we can share it as well.
Well, seeing as how the Trump administration used Havana Syndrome as a pretext to cut off diplomatic ties with Cuba, it's obviously being used as a way to like escalate US aggression towards Cuba at a particularly like tense point because of the pandemic. Someone in the YouTube comments is saying it continues the demonization of the Cuban Revolution.
Yeah, for sure. And as the documentary makes clear, like without, and there are people on the like that sort of terrifying lab scientist from Los Alamos National Labs is here being like, this isn't real. What are some other folks' thoughts? So someone in the chat just said to make people continue to fear communist government and want intervention. Yeah, totally. Like continue to like, and also like the person like that one you just quoted from YouTube, the demonization of a revolution that we've seen in the quiz, like have provided like material aid to people all over the world, including offering aid to the United States on multiple occasions that we have denied in terms of the medical intervention.
Secondary to the justification for continued aggression and like the political mechanism, it seems like it was making at least one dude a whole bunch of money. The patent that they mentioned, and you know what we know about like the U.S. medical system, it seems like it was also producing capital for a handful of quacks.
Yeah, absolutely. That is not something that I knew at all, and that's not surprising, but that stood out to me as well. Someone in the chat just said, keeps the masses in the states confused, and reactionary to the true struggle for the self determination of Cuba. Cool. Any other thoughts on this before we move on to another question, or maybe just kind of any broad response to the documentary that we just saw?
I also want to say specifically to the Havana Act, I actually said the wrong agencies at the beginning of the webinar. It actually authorizes the CIA and the US State Department to pay damages to people who claim to have suffered from Havana Syndrome, which, you know, if you were listening to like the doctors and the scientists speaking on the evidence that exists for Havana Syndrome even being a thing, then it's clear that it's like tenuous. But now there's been like millions of dollars in funding earmarked specifically for the use of the CIA and the State Department to pay damages to these people. And even if you accept that Havana Syndrome is like a real illness, which you should not, why would the CIA get the money? Like decide where the money goes? Like even that on its face, I'm like, what is that actually about? It feels like something else is happening. Why is it specifically like the regime change arms of the US government that are getting, it's like an undisclosed amount of money in the millions to pay damages to other CIA agents? Like it's just kind of like, it just seems shady to me. And this is the article that talks about it.
Thanks, Onya Sabu. I just want to piggyback on a few comments that people are posting. So a few folks talked about how it allows for the false justification of Cuba to be on the list of nations of terrorism, as well as for the U.S. empire to the fear of wanting them to placing fear so the U.S. empire can have intervention. And what that also aids in is increasing sanctions as well, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I can, you can see how it can instill a lot of fear if everyone on the TV that you're seeing or everyone on YouTube that you're seeing is talking about like psychological warfare and directed energy weapons, which I think goes to what you mentioned, Monique, and what the chat was about justifying Cuba as a quote unquote terrorist nation from like the largest, most destructive imperial power that's ever existed in the world. Okay, cool. So I'm going to post the second question we have. Feel free to keep responding to the first one, but the second one is a little bit more broad, and in thinking about like the functions that we just discussed of pushing this Havana Syndrome narrative. Why does the US spend so much resources repressing anti-colonial struggle and anti-imperialist countries like Cuba? Like, why does the US do that? And why are we using something like Havana Syndrome? Not we, but why is the US government using something like Havana Syndrome to do that? And again, you can take that answer as broadly as you'd like. Someone from in YouTube mentioned that in response to the first question, US propaganda really makes it seem like Cubans hate their government and they're constantly trying to leave it, compared to like how large the parade was at the beginning of that documentary. And then in the chat as well, just like straight old, part of it is anti-communist propaganda. Yeah, absolutely. I guess like maybe framed another way, how does the US benefit from a place like Cuba, as an example, being continually repressed and continually held back? And again, Cuba being kind of a model, or an analogy. There's a lot of other countries in a similar situation to Cuba that the United States is sanctioning, directly attacking, engaging in hybrid warfare, et cetera. Like, what does the US stand to gain from that?
I think one thing that they gain is to maintain the status quo and the like capitalist functions and imperialism. And so if people realize what's really happening in Cuba and the Cuban Revolution and socialism, people will have something to gravitate toward, to fight for. And so the false propaganda keeps people like struggling and suffering. And it just continues to create so many more disparities amongst our people. And so they gain capitalism staying as is and increasingly getting worse.
And then someone in the Facebook comments said, Cuba is such a dangerous example to the rest of the world. It has refused to surrender its sovereignty to US imperialism. The US government does not want that sort of example to exist. Another comrade on Facebook saying anti-colonial politic goes to the root, expires around the world, respond with oppression, and that the United States is trying to maintain their hold on material resources. And I feel like that's a very important point. Like, it's certainly about making people believe that no alternative to capitalism exists, which means attacking socialist states, attacking nations that are fighting for communism. But it's also about the fact that it's a lot harder to loot resources from a socialist nation where the resources are nationalized and collectively and democratically controlled versus a capitalist nation whose entire economy is arranged for exploitation. Like, the United States wants to recolonize Cuba. The United States wants to turn Cuba into like middle of America with McDonald's and Hooters and free access to Cuban land and resources to exploit. Like, that's what it's about. Another person on YouTube saying if they can sanction Cuba and by doing so make everyday life a struggle, then they can then use those struggles as proof that socialism, quote unquote, doesn't work.
Yeah, thanks for that clarifying way of discussing how like the United States explicitly wants to recolonize Cuba. I think that's really helpful. Any other thoughts about? I mean, I guess we've got on a couple themes, right? Like the way the United States can't allow these types of examples to exist, and the ways that we're trying to, or the United States needs to have access to those resources, and as Onyasunwu pointed out, like can't do that nearly as effectively, or maybe at all, with a different mode of production that Cuba and other socialist states have. So for the next question, we have a graphic that we want folks to respond to. So I'm just going to share my screen really quick. Okay, cool. So here's this is a graphic I think from like the late 19th century. So I think 1890s, maybe early 1900s. So obviously like extremely racist. But we're wondering like what this sort of image makes really clear about the way that the United States views other countries. Particularly, we see like Hawaii, we see Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the ways in which the United States views these countries and their people, and just maybe some reactions to that and how that's related to the way the United States is attacking these countries for its particular gain. If anyone has any comments on that.
I honestly, so I'm a person that appreciates when people are like racist in your face rather than like subtle. Like Boston is racist in your face and Portland, Oregon is very subtle. The early 20th century imperialist propaganda is like in your face. Like they say the quiet part out loud. Like the global South nations that the US is seeking to colonize are represented in this image in an extremely racialized way. They have very dark skin. They're depicted as uncivilized because they're like fighting. You got like a tall Uncle Sam as the teacher. Like they said the quiet part out loud. They're like, we are on a civilizing mission because you brown people don't know how to run a country. The same like underlying ideological foundation still exists to this day, but the United States is no longer as explicit about it anymore because people would call it out. But I feel like this is a very good artistic depiction of what the actual motivation for US imperialism is, or what they think their motivation is.
And you can kind of see that. Oh, go ahead, Laz. I saw you just.
All right, yeah, I think it's interesting too that all of these countries as well are like major military outposts for the US, and kind of this understanding like these Black and brown nations don't know how to use their resources or their position in the world as well as we do. So it's up to us to, insert ourselves on behalf of the betterment of the world, quote unquote.
And then someone in the YouTube comments said it's giving white man's burden. Did y'all have to read that poem in school? I had to read that poem in school. I was like, what the heck is this? By the guy that wrote the Jungle Book. But yeah, it is giving white man's burden. That whole poem is about all the Western world. Like, I guess we have to go and help these people by stealing from them and committing genocide against them. We're such saviors of humanity, civilizing the planet.
You can see that in the title, which I actually didn't see until just now, but at the bottom of the image, it says Uncle Sam's New Class in the Art of Self-Government. Yeah, which is super whack, but yeah. Any other thoughts on this image? And again, the way that it's sort of like related to the earlier discussion that we were having. Thank you for all your points, y'all.
The art, okay. Class in the Art of Self-Government, like these places weren't governing themselves for thousands of years before US intervention.
Okay, cool. Thanks everyone again for sharing thoughts. And then for the last question, I think that like for myself, I kind of started learning a lot more about anti-imperialist politics after the United States supported the coup in Bolivia in 2019, right before COVID. And so like I know that I've done a lot of both learning and unlearning over the past couple of years. And so a question that I come to myself there that I put to myself sometimes is like, what does it feel like to continue to learn these things about the government that I think most, if not all of us, live under in this country? And then what are some things that it makes you perhaps want to do because of learning those things? Yeah, and so I'll just leave it there if you want to respond in the chat, or again, I'll unmute to talk about what it feels like to learn about Havana Syndrome, about what we just learned, what some of the comrades just talked about regarding the last photo, or anything else that we've discussed, and what are some things that maybe we can do going forward about that. Someone in the chat saying demolish the myths of democracy propagated by, I'm imagining, the United States. Someone else talking about seeing how entrenched these beliefs are and how difficult it is to disentangle them with other people in our community, and kind of ask the same questions. Certainly something I can personally attest to, how hard it can be to learn things that directly contradict what you've been told for the vast majority of your life, and how it's really easy to react to it rather than sit with the discomfort. I like the word demolish, though. Demolish the mix of democracy. Also, just like, I know that I feel really angry. I feel really angry that I've been complicit in a system a lot of the time, not necessarily knowing enough about that, but it feels really hard to know that I've been complicit in the white supremacist propaganda in manufacturing consent for the different kinds of actions the US military takes on countries all over the world. And that anger, I guess, is sort of clarifying and wanting to do things like this. I feel like I'm called to something like political education. Are there other things that people are sort of called to after learning things like this, and what that might look like?
Definitely makes you want to tell the truth because it's the right thing to do, but also out of spite, because when you grow up as an African or indigenous or colonized person in the United States, you are taught to internalize the belief that there's something wrong with you. That you're not being accepted within this society because there's something wrong with who you are and who your people are. And then you realize this place is trash and always has been, and it's just a force for evil in the world. And you're oh, it's not us, it's you. And so it just makes me want to tell everybody, just take the mask off and expose it.
I agree with that. I was really excited. I'm in a Albuquerque High School alumni page, and someone was complaining about a socialism club. And I think that they were expecting people to rally and support their complaint. And people were actually really excited about the socialism club at a local high school that I graduated from. And that was really inspiring. And so I think about how we are able to, because we've been so indoctrined, in this nation, in this empire. And so being able to go to young people and work with young people and help them unlearn and learn new things and see what their interests are in abolishing this system as well. And so I'm excited about always organizing. And every time I've learned something new, it's anger, it's frustration, sometimes it's tears, and just appreciate all the community that's rallying together to abolish what exists now and create something new. And so I definitely want to go visit the socialism club at the high school.
Let me know when you do, Monica, and I will join you as a fellow alumna of Albuquerque. Someone in the chat mentioned something kind of along the lines of what you just mentioned, Monica, how insidious US imperialism is and how it makes this person want to take organized education / exposure / service trips to Cuba, the DPRK, or other socialist country, and kind of bring that experience back to organizing here. Are there any other thoughts before we move to close, just around, again, either some reactions or just some things that we might be able to try and do with ourselves and with our communities and our networks to push back against propaganda, to continue to organize with some of this information?
There's a person in the YouTube comments saying that we need to have more shows like this and like make the connections for folks. Another person on Facebook saying, I've been naively writing emails to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris against the US blockade, but that sure isn't accomplishing much. They won't even give me a real response. The Biden administration's Cuba policy is Trump's Cuba policy. Same old shit.
Yeah, that reminds me of what the journalist in the documentary mentioned about how, like, to Cuba, it's like, it doesn't matter if it's like Trump, Biden, Democrat, Republican, it's having the same effect in separating families and in, keeping, as someone earlier mentioned, keeping them on a terrorist list, which has really real ramifications for them staying on, under US sanctions, etc., which, for example, prevented Cuba from, getting a lot of syringes early on, even though they had made 5 of their own vaccines, to actually provide those vaccines to their people. Someone else in the chat is saying, I get really amped and annoying to folks around me because it all ties into everyday life and highlighting that's really important. Yeah, I relate to that. I feel like I'm constantly being like, hey, think about this. Hey, think about this. And people are like, yo, can you just let me like eat this sandwich or whatever? But I feel that. And I also think it's important to continue to bring these things up.
The tie-in to the real, like the day-to-day when it comes to Havana Syndrome is that the US government is throwing all of this funding to pay reparations to people who suffered from a fake illness. And meanwhile, over 800,000 people have died from COVID-19 in the United States. The number is almost certainly much higher. All of like the public health measures, like the eviction moratorium, like the unemployment extension, like the accessible free testing, like all of those things are gone. People are still dying. We're entering a new wave of a variant that is resistant to vaccines, and it's not getting that kind of funding. It's not getting that kind of prioritization. So you can you can spend millions of dollars, billions of dollars attacking Cuba, who's just trying to mind their own business, and is also helping the world during the COVID-19 pandemic, but you can't support your own citizens in surviving a deadly pandemic? Like, for real? Like, I feel like people have to understand that there is actually a trade-off when the United States empire decides to invest billions of dollars in messing with other countries that are simply trying to build self-determination. That means that your family is going to suffer. These countries are not your enemy.
Monica threw in the chat just the fact that the documentary that we watched has I think it's 6 episodes. So if you're like me and haven't seen all of them, like, I'm gonna definitely watch more of them. And I put the link in the chat to the website where they have both all the 6 episodes as well as some other short video and other media content around the US's hybrid war on Cuba. But because it's getting close to 75 minutes, which we wanted to do a cutoff, if anyone has anything else, please feel free to jump in. But I thought that someone's comment a few minutes ago was really a good, what's the word, sequitur? A good way to get into something that Oni wanted to mention in terms of different education trips to Cuba or other socialist nations. So I'm gonna let Oni do a shout out, and I think we'll all go on with our day.
Ooh. Thanks, y'all. Thank you, Keegan, for facilitating that conversation. And thanks to the folks in Zoom and on Facebook and on YouTube for your participation. We really appreciated your comments. These events are always better with participation and interaction because we're boring people, but you make it exciting. But anyway, so this event was organized by the Albuquerque Anti-War Coalition and the New Mexico Venceremos Brigade. The Venceremos Brigade is a solidarity delegation to Cuba, actually one of the oldest ones in the United States. And, who was that? Hello. Okay, so the Venceremos Brigade has organized a delegation to Cuba every single year for over 50 years. This past summer, we missed the delegation because of COVID-19. It was not safe to bring a delegation from the United States to Cuba. We would have spread disease from this failed state. So instead, we are planning for the 51st Brigade, hoping to have it next summer in July. More details will be confirmed shortly, but we want to bring a very large delegation from New Mexico. Last time, the New Mexico delegation was like 4 deep, and we made like a huge impression because the New Mexico left is popping. So we want to bring even more people. We want to bring African comrades, indigenous comrades, Chicano comrades, poor and working class comrades to Cuba to learn about the Cuban Revolution up close and personal, to learn the truth about Cuba and fight back against U.S. imperialist propaganda. So you can visit the Venceremos Brigade website, which is bbforcuba.com, to learn more about the Venceremos Brigade and also to get the latest details on the 51st Brigade happening next summer. And if you would like to support helping us send African, indigenous, poor, working class, Chicano folks to Cuba, youth and families to Cuba, understand international travel is very expensive. And so to bring the folks that we want to bring, we are going to have to raise money. So if you have extra coins to spare, if you would like to support the work of the Venceremos Brigade, if you would like to bring people on the front lines of social justice struggles in the United States to Cuba to see it for themselves, then you can donate to support the VB at this link online. And we are going to be fundraising for the New Mexico delegation and all the delegations from the US for the 51st Brigade for the next 6 months. So even if you don't have it now, please consider saving that link and making a donation because we really want to bring the folks that need to see it. I cannot say like the experience of seeing up close what the Cuban Revolution accomplished was transformational for me. It made me a true anti-imperialist. It made me realize that revolution is in fact the only solution, that all the things I'd heard about Cuba and most anti-imperialist nations were not true. It was transformational, and I want as many people as possible to have that experience. So if you agree, please donate to support the work of the Venceremos Brigade in the link I just dropped in the chat. And if you are interested in coming on the 51st Brigade, bookmark bbforcuba.com or bbforcuba.org and find out when the next brigade will be happening. We'll have details shortly. So we want to thank you so much for joining us on a Sunday afternoon, the day after Christmas, to learn about some truth about Cuba, to learn about how U.S. imperialism is raggedy and trifling. We hope to be back soon with more programming in support of the Cuban Revolution and more anti-imperialist programming for our community. But we hope that you have a great rest of your day. And thank you so much for joining us. Bye, y'all.
Take care, y'all. Thank you so much for joining.